Jacob Schmookler, the greatest economist you've never heard of. Don't be surprised, even if you spent your whole life studying economics, that you've never heard of Jacob Schmookler. He's purposely been left out of the narrative. In order to understand the importance of Jacob Schmookler, you have to understand something called New Growth Theory in economics. Suffice it to say that at least 2 Nobel Prizes were given out based on the work of economists in New Growth economics. The key insight of New Growth economics is that economic growth is not driven by savings and capital accumulation. By capital, we can use the definition that Nobel-winning economist Robert Solow used. He defined capital as the stock of physical assets that contribute to the production of goods and services. This includes machinery, equipment, tools, buildings, and infrastructure used in the production process. In the standard narrative about New Growth Theory, the Swan-Solow model is introduced in a paper in 1957. This is an econometric study which shows that capital is not the main driver of economic growth. Technological growth is. In fact, it suggests in this econometric study that 80% of the growth in the U.S. during the period of the study can be attributed to technological change. Only 20% can be attributed to increases in capital. However, in this model, they suggest that technological growth is not affected by economic factors at all. This is what is known as exogenous growth theory. Over the years, people became frustrated with this idea that the main driver of economic growth is not driven by economic factors. Along comes Paul Romer, and in 1986, he produces the first paper on endogenous growth theory, which means that, in fact, technological growth is subject to economic factors. Completely left out of this narrative is Jacob Schmookler's work, which was published in his book, Invention and Economic Growth in 1966. In this book, which is an econometric study, he shows overwhelmingly that inventions, that is, the things that cause technological growth, are subject to economic incentives. Jacob Schmookler was a PhD economist who taught at Michigan State University and the University of Minnesota. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1951. His pioneering book, Invention and Economic Growth, was published in 1966. It introduced the concept of endogenous growth 2 decades before Paul Romer did. His book analyzed U.S. patent data and historical cases. The opening line of the book is the question, "What laws govern the growth of man's mastery over nature?" which I think cuts through all the economic nonsense and shows that inventions, that is, technological change, are what causes man's mastery over nature, and therefore inventions are the driver of economic growth, particularly the most important form of economic growth, which is increases in GDP per capita. He emphasizes this point in this quote. He states, "Unfortunately, neoclassical as well as classical, and I would add as well as Austrian economics, seems better adapted to the analysis of replication than that of technological change. The vast economic changes since the Stone Age, or for that matter during recent centuries in the West, were possible only because of technological progress." I would say that Schmookler here is pointing out that his fellow economists have been focusing on trivial matters and ignoring the obvious main question of economics. What is it that drives economic growth? The main thrust of economics seems to be how to make you a better arbitrager. Schmookler's econometric study of the patent data from the U.S. is part of why he may have been ignored. The U.S. patent data is not a complete picture of all inventions that happen even in the United States. Unfortunately, by the time Schmookler had gotten a hold of the patent data, the patent system had already been corrupted by socialists with one of their stupid ideas: perfect competition. Despite this, it provides an objective set of data to analyze. He examines a number of important questions in this area, including whether creation of inventions is driven by the market or by scientific discovery. Is there a limited number of inventions that can be created? How many patents are commercialized? Are inventions inevitable? One of the points Schmookler makes is that society generally uses far more resources to disseminate technology than to advance it. This is a particularly relevant question to the idea of scarcity and inventions. If dissemination is not free, as Paul Romers and others suggest, then property rights for inventions are critical for dissemination. In addition, Schmookler states that economics has failed to study the most important questions in economics. Interestingly, Schmookler provides a better definition of invention than is provided in the law. He states every invention is A, a new combination of B, pre-existing knowledge, C, which satisfies some want. This definition makes clear the absurdity that something is an invention because it's built on existing things. By definition, unless you're God, you have to build inventions out of existing elements. It's called conservation of matter and energy. I have one complaint about this definition. It's that it doesn't differentiate between artistic creations and inventions. Inventions are those things that have an objective result. Artistic creations are those things that have a subjective result. Schmookler points out inventions created today are based on knowledge and inventions produced earlier, which provides a genetic or evolutionary base for inventions. A selection process as to which inventions go forward in the case of inventions is man himself. Because of this, inventing is, quote, an economic choice made in the context of economic change. Thus, Schmookler anticipates endogenous growth over 2 decades before Romer. According to Schmookler, most economists assume that inventions are driven by scientific discoveries. I've also noticed this. They put science on a pedestal and act like it drives invention, and it's secondary. Even Ayn Rand made this mistake. As a result, based on this narrative, inventions are non-economic. But Schmookler shows in his book that inventors and inventions are influenced by economic interests much more than scientific discoveries. It should also be pointed out that the creation of many inventions precede the underlying science. For instance, the steam engine preceded the science of thermodynamics and was a major impetus for its study. The most important finding in the book, according to Schmookler, is the amount of inventive activity in an industry is directly related to the size of the market. This means that the process of inventing is largely an economic activity pursued for gain, and the expectation of gain is mainly determined by the size of the market to which the invention is directed. This result is obvious to anybody who's been in the business of creating inventions and selling them. This demonstrates the stupidity of libertarians like Matt Ridley, who suggests that people invent just for the hell of it, that it's not an economic activity at all, or that inventions are inevitable, that inventing doesn't require any effort or skill. All this coming from a person who's been a journalist their whole life, and of course part of the aristocracy. Another idiot journalist who made a similar statement is George Will. Schmookler shows that over 50% of patents are commercialized. The economists Lamoureux and Sokoloff investigated the rate at which independent inventors were able to sell their patents around 1900. At the time, it was around 30%. Clearly, this destroys the myth that only 2% of patents are ever commercialized successfully. Schmookler also showed that the number of inventions are not limited, and we're not reaching some sort of limit of our ability to invent. Inventions are built on existing inventions and existing things. So every time something new is created, then the number of possibilities for more inventions just increases. This is why Millay talks about the rate at which GDP per capita has been growing since 1800 is in fact increasing in its slope. In fact, the number of inventions, the rate of growth, is happening faster and faster. Of course, this would literally be happening everywhere faster if it wasn't for the fact that socialists, and by socialists I'll take Millay's definition of all collectivists, are slowing down the process. With that quick overview of the key insights from Jacob Schmookler's book, let's look at the standard narrative about new growth theory. It starts with Robert Solow's 1957 paper, Technical Change in the Aggregate Production Function, which stated that technological change, not increases in capital, were the cause of growth. In fairness, up to that time, people had talked about three inputs to the economy: land, labor, and capital. Economic growth required an increase in one of these inputs. Since it is almost impossible to increase land and increases in labor do not increase per capita income, economists focused on increases in capital, which they said was driven by savings. In fact, you will hear this same myth repeated today over and over again, and like all myths, it has a grain of truth to it. If you're a country that is behind technologically, then all you have to do in order to increase your level of technology is to increase your level of capital, that is machinery and equipment, which allows you to catch up with first world type countries, because the capital that you're buying is essentially yesterday's technology that you don't have to invent. Invention is much harder to do than it is to buy existing technology. This is what leads to the idea of convergence, which Millay talks about. That is, that countries that are behind technologically and economically can catch up fast and grow faster than countries that are at the leading edge of technological and economic growth. But having found this key result, Solow then goes on to say technological growth is exogenous. What they mean by exogenous is that it is not influenced by economic factors. It's just some sort of background noise, sort of like a background radiation. This sort of stupidity in economics is why I have so much disdain for economists in general. Did Solow even look out the window and see that the United States was growing faster economically and technologically than Canada, which was growing faster economically and technologically than Mexico, which was growing faster economically and technologically than China and India? Were these disparities in the economy and among different countries just due to random geographical variations in technology? Since technological growth is just background noise, not subject to any economic or any other sort of influences, it would be insane to suggest that there were any significant differences in the economic growth rates among countries. This was the obvious and absurd conclusion from Solow's exogenous theory of technological growth and economic growth. Then along comes Paul Romer, who says that actually technological growth is affected by economic forces. But he defines this broader than technological change. He changes to human capital, and this is called endogenous growth theory. But Romer then, instead of talking about what is obvious, that it is inventions that drive technological growth, he calls them recipes, because marketing people, economics professors, and management experts want to believe they're also part of increasing economic growth per capita. This is just nonsensical diversity wokeness. Also, Romer is a neoclassical economist, so he tries to shoehorn the stupid idea of perfect competition into his growth theory. He suggests that property rights for invention, that is, patent, are a mixed bag. They're always a bad trade-off, according to Romer. They're good for incentivizing people to create invention, but they're bad for the dissemination of invention. Once again, did Paul Romer ever look outside the window? This idea is so idiotic it's beyond belief. Those countries that have the greatest technological rate of creation are those countries that have the greatest dissemination of technologies. So this idea just doesn't square. Not surprisingly, Paul Romer is a mathematical economist, and this is pure mathematical Platonism, not science. He's just ignoring the obvious data. Also, not surprisingly, he buys into the socialist idea of non-rivalrous goods as the basis of property rights. Perhaps this is why Schmookler is purposely ignored. He does not buy into the BS of mathematical Platonism or the socialist nonsense of rivalrous goods, so the socialist media ignores him. This is why I'm disgusted so often with economists. Milei has talked about growth theory in a number of his speeches, and he knows that Argentina is on the path of what's called convergence, which means that Argentina can grow faster than many countries because it's behind technologically. As a result, he doesn't want policies that destroy capital. He wants policies that protect and preserve capital. It's also why he's reducing or getting rid of tariffs and regulations so that new technologies can be imported more easily. The other thing that he's doing that is the result of his understanding of new growth theory is he's created a Ministry of Human Capital. While I'm not completely on board with this Ministry of Human Capital, the point of the Ministry of Human Capital is to make sure that Argentine children get sufficient nutrition and get an education, which I think is fine, although it's not completely consistent with his anarcho-capitalist ideas. It also ignores the fact that the rate of invention in countries and around the world is the result of property rights. Of course, the patent system has been internationalized and been taken over by socialists, so it's unlikely that Argentina can make any headway in implementing proper property rights for inventors. So Milei may be making the trade of what can be done, what's possible, as opposed to what's ideal. By the way, Edison had almost no formal education at all. He's one of the greatest inventors in the history of the world. Neither education or science is the driver of invention. Economic incentives are the driver of invention. The main economic incentive that doesn't involve some socialist scheme is to give inventors property rights and to make sure that they're secure, and they don't have to spend a fortune to acquire them or to protect them. These property rights are also very important for investors to decide to invest in high-risk new technologies. But of course, the global elite deep state hate new invention, and they hate inventors because they threaten the status quo. Long live freedom, damn it.